All right, well, Tara's still getting ready. I'm going to make a couple announcements. If you guys want to start to get into your seats. So we have a great night ready and scheduled for talks, starting with Tara, a couple other people from McGraw-Hill. It's going to be really great, a number of really interesting topics. Tomorrow and Friday, if you guys are not doing anything, Tara and I are going to be at JS Mobile Club right down the street, like this way, at the Aloft, or the A-Loft, whatever we want to call it. So a lot of great talks about mobile development and that type of thing. Should probably still take it available if you guys had the interest. And then in terms of the next couple months for big Angular events, Angular Connect is coming up, which is the biggest Angular conference. Is anyone going to Angular Connect, by the way? No? Okay. But it's all going to be live streamed. So you definitely should watch the live stream. I'll send out a newsletter at the end of this month with the links and all that type of stuff. It's usually great to watch some of the live streams of that. And other than that, we have some good stuff in the pipeline for the next couple months, so stay tuned. Other than that, I think we're all set. So Mike from HR at McGraw-Hill, I wanted to give kind of a hello to him. So.
Yeah, how you guys doing?
Yes.
So I'm the senior recruiter for DPG. So as DPG is Digital Platform Group. So we are the tip of the spear when it comes to learning management systems. So we are hiring 2 software engineers, senior software engineers, and senior data engineers. So between here, Boston, and Irvine, California. So if you or anyone is interested, absolutely get in contact with me. I'll be here all night on business cards. But really look forward to working with you guys. Do the Angular meetups, and if there's any questions you may have, absolutely grab me, okay? So.
What's your stack?
What's that?
What's your stack?
Yes. Oh, yes. It's gotta be Angular.
We have
the hardest one to find, right?
We have everything. You'll be hearing from a couple of guys on our team tonight. So not only is it a cool space, but we're a cool place to work. We do have a lot of technology going on in service of learning and education. The front end team, under Keith's able direction, is currently working on open sourcing some of their work. You'll see some of the product of that tonight. Pretty cool stuff. Rico's going to be presenting on that. So we're not just textbooks converting to new digital age. We actually are out there on the fringes of the technology front, pushing the envelope. And it's an interesting space. It's a positive contribution to society, and it's a great team. We'd love to have more people join us. It's quite the adventure. And I'm Andrew, by the way. I'm the CTO for Trial.
And I always say this, I feel like every meetup, but I always appreciate the great food that they have here. So let's give it up for Rod.
Rico's the mister of ceremony, so.
Yeah. All right, our first speaker tonight, a personal friend of mine, great speaker, obviously extremely pregnant. Tara, who's going to give us a great talk about how to learn Angular. Give it up for Tara.
Thank you all very much for having me, and thank you for weathering the weather and the traffic to be here tonight. Every time for the past few months and the next few months, I haven't told any of the organizers of any events I do that I'm pregnant, so I show up and they go, what? That's a pretty fun surprise. So the talk that I want to give to you today is how to learn Angular. And this is basically, make sure my timer's going. the way that I want to approach this is I started out as a Node engineer. So I was working at a platform as a service and mostly doing a bunch of my work in Node, working on Docker and doing some Go work. And then they said, could you actually go and work on our front end stuff for Angular and React and Vue? And I was like, okay. And so I wish I would have had a little bit more of a guidance to like help me go through which parts that I needed to focus on as I was learning. So for today's talk, I basically have a list of which direction to go in that will start with learn this thing, and then a few different resources to guide you onto learning that topic. I have a few helpers today. First is the Fast Falcon, the Slow Sloth, and the Optional Octopus. Because, you know, we like different ways of learning, right? Yeah. So, and it's pretty explanatory, but basically with the Fast Falcon, when you want to learn something, you don't really have that much time. Not that that is ever a problem in our industry. These are resources that will get you at least the gist of it and help you wrap your mind around something quickly. Whereas with the Slow Sloth, if you have a little more time, maybe you want to spend a weekend on it instead, it's a resource that you can delve into. And then the Optional Octopus is basically kind of delving into side topics or branching off to give you even more information about a certain topic. The other class helper today is me, Tara Minixik. So I'm a developer advocate for Progress based here in Bedford and Waltham. I'm on the Kinvey team that's actually over in the South End. And I'm also a Google developer expert in the Web Technologies team. I founded the Cincinnati Women Who Code branch and found and direct the Cincinnati Node School. So you smart people may have realized that means I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. But I lived here in Boston in East Somerville and Roxbury for like 6 years. And I worked at an atmospheric research group at Harvard, so these are still kind of my stomping grounds. But I'll have these slides up because it's just chock full of links. And so I will put them up on twitter.com. I'll at this group, I'll at NG Boston, so you can find those slides and get all the links that you need. But most importantly, on that Twitter feed is this little ball of weird, Tosh Magosh. So, if anything, follow for that reason. So, the first thing, well, real quick, before this slide, I took some out to, I have a pretty long document, but I wanted to make it a little shorter for the lightning talks. This is very slow lightning, but it's still lightning. And a prerequisite I think is important is to make sure you have good fundamentals in JavaScript. So Node School has a great, what they call workshoppers that go through your terminal and guide you through lesson plans. That is pretty quick but nice JavaScript work. And also keeping up with ECMAScript, the standardization for JavaScript, and TypeScript because Angular is written in TypeScript. So those are prerequisites. But when you get down into starting to learn about Angular, I think it's important to first start with components. And Angular applications are basically a tree of components that you're using. So you want to learn the tree, the big whole of all of it. You want to understand components really well. And another thing about learning components is pretty much every framework uses components. Elm, Vue, React. So it's something that will help you with all of the frameworks. The first part that's really good are these things called documentation. But it's pretty slow, right? To go through documentation can really take a good amount of time. And as I like to say, a little birdie flew in through my window and told me that the documentation will be updated soon for a little more tutorials and a little more guidance. So keep an eye on that. Another really great overview of components that's pretty quick, that's the Falcon, is my good friend at Microsoft Azure's team, Asim, has a CodeCraft website. And one of the first things he walks over is a really, really quick overview of components to wrap your mind around it, and then starts delving into them. Talking about the lifecycle hooks, which are important, and encapsulation, and things like that to really get your mind around it. To go even deeper, you can look into Angular elements, which is a newer thing out from Angular to basically give you more reusable components. And this is another, I have to be honest, I'm pretty biased. These are all people that I really love learning from. I think it's a good bias for how to learn how to do something talk though. So Lee Brandt runs KCDC over in Kansas City, and he has on Scotch.io, which is a site that I really like for tutorials, a whole section or a whole blog post and tutorial on how to make these reusable components. So that's your optional octopus for that section. And I also want to talk about state. We're going to go more in depth about state, but I think it's really important, again, something that's used in every framework, to understand the overview of state in general, the high level. And this name you will see a lot. He was in the Angular community, now he's really doing a lot of work in the React community. Kent C. Dodds has a really great Medium post that talks about state management on a bit of a higher level. But to go more in depth, you want to learn about observables and RxJS. Not only are observables hard to say, but they're pretty hard to learn. So this is a resource that I asked a few people on Twitter what they liked, what their resources really worked out well for them. And netbasel.com was one, it's Nathaniel, has a lot of resources on here. And he has one on observables, and you can tell that it's something hard to learn when the biggest word on the screen is fear when talking about it. But it's like once you wrap your mind around it, you get a lot of information. And guess what else helps? Documentation. So the RxJS on reactivex.io, there's an RxJS manual. And in their manuals, they have a whole section on observables as you go through their documentation and then go through their tutorials as well. But their documentation is really well laid out and really helps you basically learn these things through writing code. For a very fun optional octopus, definitely check out anything that has Tracy Lee and Ben Lesh on it, including their talks at different conferences or their ridiculous videos where there's just bound to be a lot of laughs. Speaking of laughs, this is a pretty dry topic, so I thought we may as well add some jokes in between to really mix things up. Just remember that my job is like to write software and talk about it, not to tell jokes, but we're going to try anyway. So these are just, we're going to throw these out ever so often in this talk. Feel free to shout at the answer and completely ruin my joke. So, what does a nosy pepper do? Get all up in your business. Okay, so the next thing is now we're focusing more in depth on Angular and learning Angular architecture. In Angular architecture, you have things like using dumb components, using libraries, lazy loading. There's a lot of things that are, you know, we use them in other frameworks, but you want to definitely learn them for Angular. Has anyone heard of stacklets here? Nice. So a few of my coworkers, I was surprised, hadn't heard of stacklets. And to understand Angular's folder structures and directories architecture, I think it's really handy to see it and use it. Stacklets is basically this application built by these two great people, Eric and Albert, that is using VS Code to show you online. It's an online IDE, but you go in, you select Angular, and you start up an Angular application immediately. So you can just see the way the file directories are set up and understand what the structure looks like and easily break things and hit refresh to try again. You know, so, or like basically go back and try again. But it helps a lot just to understand how they have that set up so you're not going completely from scratch. So that is the way that I like understanding the architecture well. Again, the docs too. But I'm going to stop putting slides up for Angular documentation because that is always the good, slow, steady route to go. So then the big thing is understanding what an ng module is. And you'll hear this a lot with talking about Angular. And it's basically, it takes in metadata about your application and processes it and displays it, compiles it, launches it, so that you to get everything on the screen that you intend to do. And it's using things like declarations, imports, and providers, and Bootstrap to really pull your whole application together. So, being it's so important, there are a lot of posts out there about the ng module because it's specific to Angular as well. One that I thought was really great, really delved into it, but explained it quite clearly is this one on Medium, understanding Angular modules and their scopes. Because how fun is scope, right? So we want to understand it well. And like I said, docs. But they really do have quite a thorough section in the documentation. I said I was going to put more slides up, but I forgot that I have this one. But they have a lot of really good documentation that really goes into a lot of things that we've talked about so far, talking about modules, talking about providers and lazy loading, that really help you understand ng modules in depth. And that's a good one, I think, to spend a decent amount of time on. Another thing that's really great about Angular is the template work. So with templates, they're written in HTML, but they have specific elements and attributes to do things like interpolation and property binding and event binding. And they're fantastic, and thankfully, there's a whole cheat sheet on Angular.io that walks you through what each thing is. But one of my favorite ones that's a nice optional octopus is my dear friend and coworker, Alyssa Nycol, actually has a whole blog post where she goes through and will show you the code samples, show you some snippets. I think she even walks you through with some GIFs to talk about these different bindings, to talk about the template syntax, and show you the code for it. Another great topic to really understand is dependency injection. And this is actually an overarching programming technique that basically makes a class independent of its dependencies. And so there's a lot of good information on just that high-level concept. And one that I think is pretty fun is on YouTube. And he actually does the whole, like, writing it out animation. I mean, that was pretty cool 10 years ago. So feel free to check that one out. But also Auth0 has a lot of really great blog posts. This one's specifically talking about dependency injection in a series. Ryan Chenke, you also see him a lot on the Angular circuits. He does a lot of great talks with Kim Maida as well. They do joint talks together. But he does a really great job of breaking it down and just talking about the whole dependency injection system. So on such a serious topic, how about another joke? So this one is interactive, and you have to say it out loud. And if you get it immediately and your neighbor doesn't, feel free to make fun of them. Okay, knock knock. Smell mop. It's so late, they were all going to do it.
My IQ just increased.
I really brought the class level up in this room, didn't I? Okay, so next is learning services. This is a big part, a very important part of Angular applications because it's a shared instance of a class that can be made available to any part of your application using that dependency injection system we just talked about. Because basically, it's the thought that components shouldn't be like fetching or saving data directly, and they definitely shouldn't, knowingly present like fake data. So it's something that they should focus on presenting data and delegating data. So we want to use a service. Tuts Plus I used a lot because I was a non-traditional student. I was at the Harvard Extension School, and all my classmates were like 10 years younger than me. They're like, "You want to go study in my dorm?" I'm like, "No, I don't." So I did a lot of online learning, and I like Tuts Plus a lot. So they have a whole beginner's guide and it's to services. Angular is, you may all know this, trying to get rid of that whole version number They haven't had the best history with version numbers. So soon it'll just be, thanks to ng-update, just Angular. So some of the resource I'll show will have an Angular version on it. We're going to preemptively ignore all version numbers of the things that I show and just focus on the fact that it's a great resource for learning services and whatever else. Next is the router. So basically this is taking, the router takes the state of the URL bar, right, and maps it into a set of components to render onto the screen. So that's like the super high level, why we need to learn it, because we want to make sure that we're handling all of our navigation correctly. And there's actually, we have a module to handle this. And Angular in Depth is another really great resource. They have the 3 pillars of Angular routing. And it's a very good introduction to do just a huge overview of specifically looking at the Angular router. Speaking of, it leads us to figuring out how to handle data. And this is a pretty intricate topic because you could really delve into each way to do it. And it can be anything from like fetching data with the HTTP client using like JSON data and an API and streaming data. There are a bunch of ways to go about handling data. So the 2 that I want to talk about today are the HTTP client module, and Angular University has a good post that walks you through with a quick start guide, but I did use the sloth for it because it is quite a long article but it's like maybe that's quick in comparison to all the other guides. It's pretty long, but it walks you through a lot of information. Another way to get information or data through is with Angular forms. And one of my favorite people ever to watch talk about Angular forms is Kara Erickson, one of the engineers on the Angular team. I really like the beginning of this because she loses her clicker, and it's very endearing for some reason. But she has a great talk this one is at Angular Connect with Jeff was just talking about earlier. And she does a really good job walking through how data is being handled in the Angular forms specifically. So all of this information I think is important to at least have your mind wrapped around to then learn the Angular CLI. Because again, the Angular CLI is a tool. And so you want to make sure you understand what you're using that tool for. So if you know all of these beginning parts, you can really take advantage of the Angular CLI. And honestly, once you do that, I feel like the best way to go about learning the Angular CLI is to actually use it. But one thing that for some reason I never would click on when I first started is the wiki. And it has so much information, it's really handy, and it's just a really great resource to walk through everything. Like you know how people don't make documentation and they're like, well, you can read the code. So I was the one that actually read the code, and then I'm like, why am I doing this? But they have great documentation, and another person that I really love watching talking about these things is Mike Rocky, and he has anybody heard of ngx-datagrid? So it was a whole crew surrounded around Angular. What could go wrong? So Mike has a really good talk. I don't think he's not at Wrangle anymore, is he? No. Not at all. But so he has a great talk from that cruise. So check that out to get information about the CLI. He does a decent amount of talks, letting you know how to go through, and so does John Papa actually as well. But I like Mike's one. Time for a joke then. So this one, I'll just do it. What do you call a Frenchman wearing sandals? Flip-flop. Sorry. Okay. So next is we're getting even more into like reactive extensions, specifically for Angular. So we want to talk about ngx. Again, like this one I pretty much saved for like the last, I'm pretty sure it is, the last thing to learn. Because it truly is not simple, which is great because it's great to have complex tools, but it makes learning it, it's basically like Redux patterns using RxJS observables. And we already said that RxJS and observables aren't that easy. So when we're building something on top of that, it's good that we learned observables in RxJS early on so that we can build upon that to learn ngRx. It provides just like tons of advantages for simplifying your application state, but you want to make sure you understand what you're doing with it and what you're doing with like ngR effects. And that's basically a library that allows the application to communicate with the outside world by triggering side effects. Just explaining all of that, it's something that you want to make sure you understand what you're doing, right? There's this great group of Angular consultants at Narwhal, and they have a lot of, like one of their employees, James Henry. I actually didn't add the TypeScript talks, but he has a lot of great posts at jameshenry.com about TypeScript. And then one of their co-founders, Victor Sotkin, has a ton of posts on Medium, and one of the ones he has on there is Angular and RxJS, talking about the patterns and techniques that will really help you utilize ngRx quite well. But the way he goes into it and talks about it, they have talks as well on ngRx that are really great. Another one is Ultimate Angular, and this is started by Todd Motto, basically making a bunch of in-depth tutorials, and he has one in particular on ngRx stored effects, and I know that he did a whole workshop at ngconf last year that people really learned a ton from. So, and as you see, speaking of how complicated, just this class is 41 lessons in 7 hours long. So that one, just to really wrap your mind around how much you could do with ngRx. It's pretty complicated. So one thing, again, that's really important to me, because I was learning things remotely, was the human resources. And the first thing I had on here were guiding people towards Angular meetups. But I think you probably have heard of one already, because you're here. So definitely, utilize your Angular meetups, and there are even some that are posted online. But also, my favorite, Angular conferences. Jeff talked about Angular Connect that's coming up, but my complete favorite is the very first one I went to, which was ngconf. And this one is coming up in May of next year. They have opportunities ever so often on Twitter and on their website to win a free ticket, and it's so worth it. It's in Salt Lake City, which is interesting, but it's huge. It's a really big conference, and everybody there is so nice. I met some of my first core team Angular and Angular community people at ngconf, and I never felt more welcome in a community than I did at ngconf. So I'm also emceeing it, but whatever. Also, my favorite is for podcasts, because not only with Angular Air, it's all on YouTube, and so you see the people that you're talking to, which is really nice. And with DevChat, Adventures in Angular, it's all audio, so whenever you're, stuck in traffic or on the T, you can have some information about Angular. And they interview really great people. It's very fun to listen to. So Angular Air, you can find that on YouTube. It was funny, I went here. This is such an old clip of Angular Air. I think it's 3 years old. But are you often on the host or panel? Panel. Okay, so you all see Jeff, beautiful face on the panel. My good friend Alyssa Nykel, Justin Schwarzenberger from that group Narwhal usually hosts it. Oh yeah, there you go. There you go. And Mink goes on there.
I think I was doing that to troll Ken, because Ken had just announced that he was moving to React, so I wore a React shirt just to...
Good try. Yeah, we know the true story. You're a React groupie, aren't you? But that's a really great resource to learn a lot, and they always have so much fun. It's a really great show to watch. And they have all their old episodes on there, and you can watch and comment on it live. And you can find all of the Angular Adventures in Angular episodes on devchat.tv. There's also they have another one on here that's like my Angular story and also my JavaScript story. You have really good people on the panel. Joe Eames and Aaron Frost are actually the organizers, some of the organizers at ngconf, and do a lot in the Angular community in general. John Pop is sometimes on there on the panel, and then Charles Maxwood basically is on all 72 podcasts that they have on here. Maybe it's not 72, but it feels like there's 72 podcasts that he hosts on there. Nonetheless, it's a really great program to watch. So I wanted to end with one more joke to remember me by. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Tank. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much for having me. If you're all up for it with the high spirits of that last joke, I would love to do an animated picture with you that I will post to Twitter. You can turn away if you don't want to be on it, but you have to move if you're going to be in it. Can everybody do this? I'll just say move, and feel free to just move how you want. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Perfect. So yes, you can find this picture along with my slides at tzmanix on Twitter. This is Tosh Magosh writing my slides. Thank you all very much. Feel free to come back.
Thank you, Tara.
Oh, sorry.
So next up, we're going to have, you can go in whatever order, but Victor next, or Victor? Yeah, okay. All right, let's give it up for, or how many minutes to get set up? A few seconds. Okay.
Do you want me to tell some
So-
jokes? Oh, no?
Oh, yes. So Victor Mejias is from the Irvine office from McGraw-Hill. Actually, if you guys are not familiar with California, I actually worked in Irvine for a while. A great area. Recommend it close to beaches and that type of thing. I'm sure. Do you live close to the beach? Or do you live in?
I live inland. I live like an hour away from the beach.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't
Okay.
stop me from going.
Yeah. You can still make it over there, right? So Victor's going to talk about a subject that I know every single person in this room is super interested in, that is thinking about every single day: unit testing. It's something that we all love and do.
Is that font size okay?
What's that?
Is that font size okay? Cool.
All right, so let's give it up for Victor.
What is up, everyone? Happy to be here. Again, I'm from California, so chilly here.
It's not too bad right now.
I'm missing the sunny weather, but Keith is my boss, so I'm making my quarterly visit here. So I always love being here in Boston. Cool. So I don't have any slides, so I'm going to show you pretty much how to work with Jest. So who writes unit tests at work? Okay, and then from that very, very small subset, right? Who runs your unit tests in a CI environment, like Travis or Circle? Okay, cool. And I'm assuming you're using the default Karma and Jasmine stack, right? Cool. So yeah, so that's what the default, what the CLI gives you, right? ng test, and then you can pass in some flags like --watch to run it in watch mode, a single run to run it one time, and you can pass in the coverage flag. For the most part, I've been okay, happy with it, So this is by default, you don't get this like detailed output. This is just some extra config that I added in the KarmaCon file to give me that detailed output and then generate code coverage reports, right? So for the most part, I was happy with it, but I felt like as your app was growing and you write more and more unit tests, I mean, this one has close to 1,000 unit tests, right? It starts getting kind of slow, and I feel like, you know, for the developer like myself, I wanted to try something else, and so that's why I ended up going with Jest. So who's heard of Jest? Yeah. Okay. So it's made popular in the React community. Okay. No, you can't just use it in React, right? It is just a JavaScript testing framework. You can use it in vanilla JavaScript. You can use it in other frameworks. And contrary to popular belief, you can use it in your Angular applications. Okay. So I went ahead and tried it out, and I just loved it. And I feel like Jest is really made for the developer. Okay. It's meant for developer productivity. It is. You know, people say like Jest is fast. Like it is fast. People say React is fast. No, it's not. You know, Jest is fast. Okay. And one of the things that really sold me was a snapshot testing, which I'll be covering with you in a bit. So if you're using Angular v6 and CLI v6, like they have this new thing called schematics, right? You can support schematics. So one way to set it up is to use a schematic. So you could just do something like ngx-datagrid. Rebug, they did this schematic. ngx-add, you know, a schematic, and it'll configure Jest in your app. Or one of the other ways you could do is configure it manually, which is what I'm going to show you how you can set it up, and it's not that hard. So, being your Angular application, you need to install a couple of dependencies. One of them will be Jest, obviously, right? Jest preset Angular, which is what makes it work in Angular. Install some types to make sure that Jest is recognized with TypeScript and plays nicely. And then the next thing you need to do is configure this jest.config file. So if we look at our application, it's just a file that you drop in, jest.config.js. Yes?
Why do you still have Karma in
Good question. So this is an application from work. I left it in there just for legacy purposes. As some things that you label as tech debt, we're going to strip it out. But it's still there for reference. Not many engineers are familiar with Jest, so I did leave Karma in there. Cool. So we drop in this Jest config file, and let's just go over this configuration. It might look a bit scary with the crazy regex and stuff, right? So they a saying calls like you have a problem and then you solve it with the regex. Well, now you have two problems, right? So it takes time to be able to like decipher the regex, right? Okay, so cool. Preset, we want to tell Jest what preset to use. We obviously want to use the Jest preset Angular, okay? We have the entry file, so in your Angular app, it's like test.ts inside of source, right? That's just pretty much basically it. And if we look at that file, all it is imports the preset, okay? So let's look at the transform. So we need to transform our files, right? So what this is pretty much saying is for TypeScript and HTML files, use a preprocessor from the preset that we're using, okay? For all other JavaScript files, use the Babel Jest preset, okay? So it does use Babel. Babel's a fantastic compiler, right? So it's the same, use that. Now what is this transforming ignore patterns? Okay, so by default, when you're testing your apps, Jest doesn't transform packages in your node modules, right? But so for example here, this is an internal library to McGraw-Hill. Common to Angular applications, they don't ship like the normal quote unquote JavaScript files. So we're negating this. So what this is saying is even though it's in the node modules, go ahead and transform them pretty much. That's all I'm saying here. And then I'm configuring code coverage and even some thresholds, right? As it's a good idea to configure thresholds, right? So especially if you want to start, enforcing, your team to write unit tests. So even though your unit test suites pass, if they falls under the code coverage, then the test suite may fail, right? So it may seem kind of like you're being a jerk, but it's a very good way to start, not enforcing, motivating your team members to write. And that is it. That is the setup file, okay? And then you just run it, and it just kind of feels like magic as you're working with it, right? So let me go ahead and run Jest here. So if you go to package.json, I have an npm script here. Call it test watch. It's just running the Jest CLI, running it with the code coverage flag, and then running it with the watch flag, which will throw you in like an interactive watch mode. run npm run test watch. Similar to how when you run ng test, right, it has to transpile all your files. Okay, so by default, it kind of knows what you've ran. Okay, so nothing failed here. And it's able to recognize, because I ran it like a few minutes ago, right? It's able to recognize that since the last time you ran it, like no files have changed. So it's just sitting there, hey, what do you want to do? As opposed to like, I'm not trying to bash on like the other way, right? But it just goes again and compiles the whole thing, right? So Jess is smart enough to know. Very simple CLI. Let's press A to run all the tests. So it's running through my test suite. This is not an error, just a warning that moment.js is throwing. I should probably fix that. And give it a few more seconds, and then it's gonna give you a very nice output of your current status for your test suite, right? Cool. So I have 11 test suite pass. That's a total of 157 specs. It gives me the amount of snapshots. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then I get a nice code coverage summary at the end. Okay, and I'm still in watch mode, so it's very useful if you're running like a TDD session or you're just trying to test your components and have like your test running. So let's go ahead and make a test fail. Let me go to this test, right? So it's just calling a method on the component, running an assertion, and then it's supposed to be, the label is supposed to be all students. Let me just change it to something that it's not supposed to be. Watch mode picks it up. I'll show you how you can just focus on the change files. Right now it's running my test suite again, and obviously the spec should fail, right? You just give it a couple more seconds. I think it was 24 seconds, right? How long it took. Cool, and then it says one test failed, right? Very, very nice output, points to the exact line where the spec is failing. Expected value to be wrong text, but it's actually supposed to be all students, right? Okay, cool. So notice at the end it says watch usage. Press W to show more. Okay, so let's press this W, right? And I can just focus on only running my failed test, and I just press F. Now it's just gonna focus on that one test, because obviously, like, I'm trying to figure out, because it often happens. It's like a domino effect, right? You change something, and then like 10 other tests fail, right? Well, I just want to focus on those failed tests and not run the entire thing. So you go ahead, here, and then trying to change it, and it's only focusing on my failed test. Something that you could do with some workarounds with using the other way, but it's still kind of slow and it's very annoying, especially when you have a bunch of output to just focus on that test. Cool. So obviously, let me go ahead and fix that. It's supposed to be all students. And it just says test 1 passed, right? Okay, so my failed tests, they're all like now passing, right? So I can just go back to my interactive watch mode. I can press O to only run the test to the change files, right? But that was my previous run, so everything's good, right? And let me just go ahead and run all my tests. F to run all my tests, and now it's going to run it again. So again, it's very, very useful, right? Like you're there in your CLI. It's very friendly. It's fast, and things like that. So the next thing I want to do is this thing called snapshot testing. So naturally, Keith will be talking about visual regression testing, and that same concept applies to snapshot testing. So the idea here is that you take a frame of reference of like whatever serialized thing you're trying to assert, whether it's an object or it's a string or a number or anything like that. You take a frame of reference, right, which in Jest is called a snapshot, and you verify it, right, that's what it's supposed to be, and you actually check it in as part of your repository. Okay, it's part of your source control. Now, what does that look like? Let me search for the snapshot for this one. So one of the ways that you would test this, right, is, for example, you could do quick stack component gradebook categories property to be XYZ, or other property to be this one, right? And sometimes you have a massive object, and what I've seen is like for a simple spec, right? You want to assert something about the entire object, and that object may have 10 properties, and so you have 10 expectations there, right? But in this case, I'm just saying expect this object to match a snapshot. And so what just actually does is there's a snapshots folder, right? And this is what the snapshots look like. Okay, so go ahead, it creates like a serialized version of like an object or a number or a primitive value and just spits it out, okay? So in this case, I want to assert that that object looks like this, right? Value of 1 and value of homework, okay? So the first time you run it, it'll create that snapshot. You go ahead and verify that's what it's supposed to look like, right? It requires like human verification. And if it is, then you just move on and you check it in, okay? So for instance, let's say requirements change, and so this specific spec uses this map gradable categories. Let's go in there, right? And then in turn, it uses this set gradable category. And instead of the value, let's change it to a view value, right? I go back in watch mode. Notice that in those specs I have to match snapshot, right? So now I should expect those snapshots to fail. So about 10 more seconds, it was about 20 seconds, right? Okay, cool. It tells me one sweep failed, and then 2 snapshots have failed. The reason that they have failed is because as it's running right now, the snapshot that it generated looks different from the point of reference that's in there, right? If we inspect these snapshots, they haven't changed, right? Because I haven't updated the snapshot. So let's press W to show more, right? And what I recommend is to use I to update failing snapshots interactively. You could press U, like if you trust yourself, and it'll just update all the snapshots, right? But I want to do it interactively, so I'm going to press I. It's going to take probably the same amount of time. I'm not sure when you do it interactively, it doesn't show you like the output that it's actually running. It just sits there silently, but it's kind of doing the exact same thing. Cool. Now it's focusing on these snapshots, right? And the reason is because it's part of the same suite. That's why if you would have like other snapshots failing in another suite, then that would come in the next interactive mode, right? So then we can inspect these snapshot, right? So we saw this object. Okay, before it was gradable category was number 1, but because it changes to the label, the view value, now it's homework. I was like, okay, yeah, I want it to be that value. Then you can go ahead and inspect the next snapshot. Instead of the value 1, I want it to be the string homework. Okay, so that looks good to me, right? And then so you could do U to press to update the current snapshots. And then in a moment, you should see both of these update. I don't have any jokes for my joke break. Yes. Hey, but you laughed. What's up?
Yeah, I have a question for that simple. It's like an object of 2 values and you use snapshot for it. Would it be better just to put those into the test file itself where you can change it right there versus putting it in snapshot and then have it change to 2 files?
You mean if you're trying to verify
you can do 2 equal or something to.
Yeah, but that's the whole point of the snapshot, right? Like, why write like 3 expects whether you can just write 1, right? And then you can have your snapshot, which is your one source of truth. I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
You just write 1 expect to match exactly the
Oh, right, to equal and then the object. Yeah, so you could do it that way, right? And I have done it, but then when you do something like that, so you could do this, right? And then 2 equal. So this is what it's saying. Why don't I just do this? A, 1, B, 2. What if I go all the way down to Z, right? What's more readable to you? Is it this to equal this object or to match snapshot? And then you have one source of truth. It's all a matter of preference, right? You don't have to use snapshot testing for everything. But I will show you in a moment what to use it for and which I think will sell you big time. So I've updated my snapshots, right? And then so if I go back to the snapshot file, this was the value 1, now it's a string homework. And then I believe this one, right, if you go back to VS Code, which tells you the files that changed, right, you can now verify as part of your pull request, okay, the snapshot, the point of reference has changed, this was a value, now it's a string, and so on and so forth. And then same thing as this one right here. Okay, so that's with objects, right? But another cool thing, and I feel like this is the one that truly just like sold me on snapshot testing, was that you can serialize your components in your test and just say expect fixture to match snapshot. Okay, because what I have here in test is just a basic table component, right? So I'm specifying here I'm using like a test host hardness. I'm giving it some input, right? And then declaratively specifying how the tables should be, how the columns should be laid out. Now you can write like a ton of different tests for this table component, right? Like you give it some inputs, and then you can check whether it generated the correct amount of headers. Another test would be it generated the correct amount of table rows. Another test could be it generated the correct data in each cell, right? The other solution is like, and this is very popular in React, you can just say like expect your component to match snapshot. And then you literally do expect your fixture to match snapshot, Jest will serialize it for you. And then you go ahead and actually, it renders the entire component, right, the entire DOM tree in your snapshot. So instead of you like writing tests for like, okay, you use like a debug element and you're querying for stuff like all over the place, tests that are very brittle, right, you can just like serialize the entire fixture, and it'll dump the component version on this one. And then from here, you can inspect, right? Like, okay, it's generating the correct amount of table cells and the correct data in each one, right? And if it's not looking right, then it's up to you to actually make it look right, okay? So this is like literally what sold me on this, that I could just serialize the entire thing. Now this one, do you prefer writing like 10, 12 specs, or just like serialize the entire thing? And then you have a snapshot, right? Cool. Yeah, and that is all I got. Like, it's very easy to set up Jest. You'll be happy you're testing. If you don't like it, I think you'll like it after doing this. Yeah. So that's all I got.
Thanks a lot, Victor. What's that? There it is. All right, so everybody knows Rico is going to be talking about ngx-datagrid. So I think that any of us who have tried to do something with a lot of data visually on the page know that it's very difficult. It's technically difficult to render a lot of data and to keep it updated, especially depending on the different use cases. So there are a number of different solutions out there, and Rico's going to be talking about ngx-datagrid. So let's give it up for Rico.
Alright. Hi guys, my name is Rico, for those of you who haven't met me through some of the other meetups. I'm a lead software engineer at McGraw-Hill. Andrew was talking about some of the cool stuff that we're doing at McGraw-Hill, including Angular. And one of those things is ngx-datagrid, which I'm going to talk about today. So ngx-datagrid is a data table component for Angular that supports virtualization, both vertically and horizontally. So a lot of the data grids or data tables that you might have used, they're typically going to support virtualization vertically, but they kind of treat horizontally as a second-class citizen. So things like pagination, right? You don't paginate horizontally. You don't really, hopefully you don't have to scroll through too many things horizontally. But for our use case at McGraw-Hill, we needed to support a large number of students, so a couple thousand students in a class, and a couple hundred assignments. And if each one of those cells has multiple bindings for colors, maybe somebody is is submitting an assignment late, so that color needs, that cell or that score needs to show up as red. Somebody's currently working on an assignment. There's a whole bunch of requirements for one of the teams that I was on, a gradebook team that uses this data table. So like a single cell can have 10, 20 bindings to show different states of a particular grid. There's comments that you can put on assignments all directly in this big giant grid. And if we don't implement virtualization, which I'll discuss virtualization in just a second, you're literally going to have millions of bindings, right? And we can't possibly support that. We can't scroll through that without it being all jittery and janky. So hence the need for ngx-datagrid. So McGraw-Hill has officially open sourced ngx-datagrid as of about an hour ago. I'm super excited about that. So just for some competitors, currently, if anybody has used datagrid, you guys should all be familiar with ngx data table from Swimlane. That one, and then maybe if your data table isn't that complicated, you might be using the CDK from Angular Material. There really isn't anything else. And there's a AG-grid, agnostic grid. So that is a framework agnostic grid that you can use. The thing with, we at McGraw-Hill started using the Swimlane's data table at first, but they didn't support the horizontal virtualization. So when we got to classes that had 500 assignments, even if we were only showing 10, 20 students, those bindings just built up, right? And they just multiplied really quickly. And things would slow down. We couldn't scroll properly. Just interacting with the app all over the place slowed down a lot. So hence the need for this guy. So I have all of the features that ngx-datagrid supports, and I could have probably cut that in half if I just listed all of them individually. But I wanted to explicitly state like that all of the features that you can do for vertical, you can do it for horizontal as well. So pagination, pinning columns, all of the virtualization both horizontally and vertically. When I initially used the Swimlane's data table, it said virtualization. They support virtualization, so I was like, oh great, we're all set. They didn't specify that it was only for vertical, not horizontal. So we built the whole thing with using that data grid, and then found out that it was canceled because they didn't do it horizontally. So I called that out specifically. So what is virtualization? Who has played a video game before? Some kind of first-person shooter. You're walking, all of a sudden, bam, there's a mountain, right? You're only drawing the stuff that you need to see. And this is like a huge, it's a trick that people have been using for a long time. You only render what's on screen. So if something's blocking a complicated thing that you need to render, don't render that thing. Don't spend the CPU cycles trying to draw that thing. And this is what virtualization does for us. Just only draw what we need to see on the screen, and we can use some tricks to help pretend that the stuff is, we pretend that the stuff is there. So like, I'm going to show you guys. So this is a really ugly data grid that I implemented. This is actually, if you guys go check out the go back page. So at the github.com/mheducation, if you npm install the app, there's a demo grid, and this is it. So what I did in this demo grid was I built a data source that's 250,000 data points, and for each one of them, I just have the number one. There's no complicated data set.
I'm sorry, I want to step back. You said you open source. Did you release it on NPM yet?
So no. You can build it yourself. So I have to packager it, ngpackager it, and do the npm stuff. Haven't done that yet. I just finished the presentation. I'm sorry. But yeah. If you check it out and ngserve, all right, you'll see this. And oh, oops. Thank you. Sorry guys. Those are mirroring screens. So you see this. And this is this is really tough. So I have 250,000 data points. I went through in a loop and created the 250,000 numbers. So it's just the number 1, 2, 3. I just go horizontally. I set up some pagination. So I have 500 cells horizontally, 500 cells vertically, and that's 250,000. So what virtualization is in terms of the data grid by trying to inspect element here. I have 100 columns and 100 rows, and then those sets are paginated. So I have some pagination 500 times, so I can paginate to the 500. So that's 10,000 cells that I'm rendering on the screen right now. But I'm not really rendering the 10,000. I'm only doing about 60. So we figure out how many we need to fill up this box. And then I can calculate how many I need to fill up the box and only draw that number. And the trick that I was talking about is you basically use, if you guys can see, come on. All right, well. So we can see over here with transform. I'm setting out the CSS transform property with translate X and translate Y. What we're doing there, all right, is I'm shifting these cells around on the screen to make it appear that you're scrolling through the 10,000 cells. So we don't really have 10,000 cells, we only have a couple, or 60 or so. And when one scrolls off, so if I keep this guy highlighted, you can see all the updates. So I'm updating the translate X and the translate Y to reposition the cells as they get scrolled off. So I have this guy. This band, I'll scroll him up, and you can see that the value gets updated and it gets relocated over here. So the same one is used over here to draw this guy, and then when I scroll it off, I don't need it anymore. It comes back over here, and now the value is updated.
There's two problems though. One is visualization, the other is going and getting the actual data. If you've got that large data set, how are you fetching it?
Yeah, so for
Pagination is supposed to delay the fetch. So you don't have to fetch it all at once. Are you doing that, or is the pagination only for visualization?
so there's an observable data source that you can update as you get more data anytime you want. For this demo example, all I'm doing is going through in a loop and creating all the data right on screen, right? So
the bigger problem is going to be fetching over the network.
Sure, yeah, and if you want to,
rendering the data.
Yeah.
Bigger problem is not the data in memory, it's the data on the screen.
Yeah, like even in React, I used the old React data grid, and it would just come to a crawl, just like 100-something entries. But the fact that that's really smooth is pretty impressive just from a rendering perspective.
So yeah, if you need to transfer the data and get all the data, that can be a challenge. You can do that in the background, like while somebody interacts with it, but that's going to be an issue, no matter what, unless you get all the data to the front end.
I'm not trying to say that what you've done is not impressive. It's awesome, and I want it. I want to use it. My question though is it does the component support fetching as a part of the pagination?
So it's an observable. So yes, you can update the observable and load in more data anytime you want, and as soon as you update the data source, then it will be reflected in the grid. We could probably build in some more venting or some more outputs, right? So like when you reach a boundary, the gradebook team that has implemented this for MHE didn't need that. So
if you scroll to the end of like horizontally,
yep.
does it stop and then you have to kind of page through that, or does it kind of do like an infinite scroll where it's kind of when that hits that threshold then it kind of fetches, or leads to an event saying, hey, I need more data?
So when you scroll to the end of the data, it's just going to stop. Like it doesn't know that there's more data.
Yeah.
You could set it up. I don't think that you can specify. It looks at the size of your data and calculates how big it needs to make everything and do the virtualization. So as soon as you update it, it will update itself. That's what I was saying. Like we could build in the extra outputs to try and notify you. So if you needed to load more stuff, you could. Right now, I don't support that.
It is open source.
You'll take pull requests.
Pull requests?
Cool. So yeah, just to talk through a couple more of the features. So you can see the header is pinned at the top. You can only pin the header. You can only customize the height of the header. So when I'm doing this virtualization, one of the design decisions was that you needed to know ahead of time what the height and the width of the cells that you're going to be scrolling through are, right? Because we're doing math and we're faking things. If you have a dynamic, like let's say you're loading an image or something in here, you don't know what the height and width is for every single image. When you're scrolling through, and I have this scroll bar, right? We want the scroll bar to be representative of where we are in the data. If I don't know what the height and width is, I can't do that. If that's something that's important to you, like and you can't figure out what the height and the width is for your data cells, you're gonna have to find another grid. Or you can solve that problem and contribute. But I couldn't do it, and we didn't need it because we're doing a gradebook, and everything fits pretty much right in there. So. So yeah, we've got the pin header. You can see that the template for this header is different. You can specify like grab this guy. And take a look at. So this is the app component. I have a template. This gets passed into the data grid. And I have, this is the header template versus just a regular cell template. And all I did was put some CSS to make the text red and add this extra text. But you can really go crazy with the customizations. And so I took a screenshot of our data grid. So this only has 4 students because it's just test data. But this is the stylized version of ngx-datagrid that the board uses for our open learning gradebook. So like I was saying, this comments, calculated percentages. Each one of the cells can have its own custom template as long as the height width is the same. But for this guy, the initial column, the initial row, you can specify a different height, so you can have some kind of header. The same thing with this column. sorting, filtering, all that. It's still it's kind of a hack. If you want to sort it or filter it, you just do it on your end, right? Because we have an observable data source. If you want to sort it or filter it however you want, you just update it and we'll render it. Does everybody understand the virtualization thing, right? Like we can just imagine that there's all the data going this way and that way, and we're just looking right in on this and only drawing those guys. Anybody ever? Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Talk about virtualization. So, ain't nobody got time for that. Request animation frame. All right. This is the trick on how we are able to render all that stuff, right? Like, this is. I'm gonna go to this guy. I'm gonna grab my scroll bar and just scroll through all, like, 10,000 cells of data like it's nothing. And none of that would be possible if it wasn't for request animation frame. So has anybody done any video game programming in JavaScript? You know what request animation frame is? Some people are masochists.
If you just want high frames per second.
Yeah. So the request animation frame, you can do all of your, if you're doing complicated CSS transitions, if you're moving stuff around the screen a lot, you want to use request animation frame. And what that's going to do, you guys can't see the screen anymore. What that's going to do is only update your CSS. So we're only repainting and repositioning the screen when the browser's ready. So when I grab that scroll bar, right? Let me show you the code. So I literally have a scroll handler that is updating every pixel, or it could be updating every pixel, where what needs to be rendered on the screen. And if I'm grabbing the scroll bar and scrolling through like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pixels, you can't possibly afford to be calling your re-render, right, every time. So request animation frame is a function that you pass it a callback, and that will render your updates just that one time. So you can make a whole bunch of changes to the CSS properties, but they're not going to get re-rendered on the screen. You're not going to get repainted until the browser is ready to handle that. And as long as all of your calculations happen in like 20 milliseconds, you're good to go, and you'll have a 60 hertz refresh rate, and you're not going to have any jank when you try to scroll. So if you have these unnecessary updates, right, where maybe because you're scrolling really fast, you should be updating, but the screen's just not ready. And that's what all these unnecessary red bars are. And we'll just forget about those and wait until the browser's ready to update, and then reposition and do a repaint. I think that's all I got.
Are there any guidelines for accessibility? How would you access?
Yeah. So actually, infinite scroll is really difficult to try and make accessible. Virtualization, it's going to be the same thing. There really isn't that much support for it. There isn't any support for it really. There was one other thing though. Sure. So I want to show this. This is an example of infinite scrolling, and some people will confuse the two terms, like infinite scrolling and virtualization. They're two separate things. Kind of a bad example, but what happens with infinite scroll is when you get to the bottom, you see that the scroll bar on the bottom it just pops back up a little bit. But this is already a lot of data, so the actual scroll bar is pretty small. But if it was something smaller to begin with, you'd see the scroll bar get smaller and smaller every time. All we're doing is just appending stuff to this list. And you're not removing any of the stuff up top. There's no hiding. So if this is complicated stuff that has data binding, you're gonna kill your browser. You're gonna kill your client. The difference with virtualization. So this is an example of the Angular material where they do virtualization just on this list. So you can grab like the scroll bar, you can scroll through it just like the data grid. But once you get to the bottom, you're stopped. Now it's going to the page. That's what's worth that to the top play. Does anybody have any questions?
Just a small point. Does the virtualization have command F functionality? Can you search through?
You can't command F for something that's off screen. That'd be really cool. I like that. That's a good question.
It should be that hard to write it, but you'd have to write some keys. Well, you just try to search against the data set, it would go against that. And then you'd have to know your position and reposition it. I think command F something had the DOM itself. Yeah, but not, you could use the browser service, but you could use it in actual search. You could in that front, what you can't do.
Yeah, if you hijack, Control F, I'd be pretty pissed at you, but you could do that, I guess.
It's forward.
Any other questions? Come talk to me if you guys want any more details about it if you're really interested. Thanks, guys.
All right, so for the last talk evening, we're going to keep talk about visual regression testing. So this is something that, one of those areas I think are underappreciated, I think, but it can save your bacon if you. I'll demonstrate. Okay, good. And so it uses Protractor, I think part of the thing is going to get into, which is an end-to-end testing tool. So let's give it up for Keith.
Thanks. Last talk, it's another testing talk. Why wouldn't we just use Victor's testing? That looks pretty sweet. And that's stuff that I already know how to do. So I will show you first why, and then I'll show you that it uses tools that you already use if you're doing anything with Protractor at all. Even if you're not, which I was not, it wasn't that hard to get to. So this is kind of a view of our ecosystem. And we have a shared component library and shared styles. We try to keep our massive platform as dry as possible. So if you're running a dropdown, you should not be. There's already a dropdown. It's accessible. It's responsive. It's got all the bells and whistles. It's skinned already for you. And as that idea of keeping everything super dry became more popular, we found that, in fact, that dropdown, as an example, is in 40 repos. And there's lots of these components, search component, type ahead, all of that kind of stuff. So when I break if I broke the search icon, let's say, I'm going to affect 40 repos here. And if only 20 of those repos are building that day through their CI process, and they're going to get into the dev or QA environment, and maybe if only half of those repos are then owned by different teams, I'm still going to have at least 10 P2, P3 bugs, probably 10 pissed off PMs coming at me. That wasn't the most fun. So I figured, how can I engineer my way out of this? We should use visual regression testing. We should be able to test that the pixels are legit, that our things rendered the same way every time. And there's lots and lots of tools that do this. There's probably 40, 50 tools that do this. A lot of them are Halloween themed, fortunately. They're built on Phantom.js, which is cool. We actually did some testing with 3 of these that we liked the most. And we very nearly adopted one of these. And then just before we were about to kick it off formally, we found this thing called Protractor Image Comparison, which is what I'm going to demo. It's super simple to set up. It seems tight for a lightning talk at 7:45. It's Wednesday yet. Okay, good. There's a couple steps. We're going to concurrently run ng server and Protractor. We'll set it up. We'll set up Protractor capability so that we get the same kind of response when we run it locally or when we run it in Circle or Jenkins or wherever. We're going to test and we'll take a look at some outputs for failures and for success. get out of PowerPoint. So there's a couple tricks here. First is that we need to concurrently run ngserve and protractor. You could point protractor at your dev environment, QA environment, and do whatever your tests are. In this case, I want to be able to do it locally because I'm working on stuff. So I use this app called Concurrently. Give it to node processes. It runs them at the same time. You can give it flags for when to die if one of them fails, which I have set up here. So if my test fails, kill ngserve. I also want to wait and make sure that ngserve comes up before I do anything. When it does, I'll kick off my protractor job. Straightforward so far. Not too much black magic. Here's the protractor conf. There's a couple of new things in here. First of all, we're going to include protractor image comparison. We're going to set up a baseline folder. So we're going to take screen caps of components, or in fact, even of the whole screen. If you didn't like Victor's snapshots, you could use screen caps instead. Is my table rendering correctly? And get like a pixel perfect, or give it a fudge factor. It's okay if it's pretty close. This is where we're going to store our pings. And we need to be able to store the pings that we generate as we run the tests so that we can debug if we find something that's new or we find something that's failed. We want to be able to look at those pings and see what's up. I'll show you that too. And the other interesting trick is turning off anti-aliasing, especially if you have a lot of text. It's a little bit different on different virtual machines, so this tends to throw up tests. And then there's the Chrome options. We want to run headless. We want to turn off the GPU because we want it to be the same no matter what our virtual machine is. We want the same window size regardless of where our virtual machine is. If you run it in Jenkins or you run it in Circle, you run it local, you may get something different. You got to lock that down. The last one is this device scale factor. This sets the pixel resolution for the virtual machine that you're going to render your pics in. If this is different, you'll get very small normal sized icons or double sized icons. So I'm going to keep that locked. Easy to set up. And then what do our tests look like? Pretty standard for protractor, I think. Find me an element, get protractor image comparison, check the element, call it something human readable so that I can find it later. And this will give us a variance value. You can set it to be numeric 1 to 100. You can make it more specific if you like decimals. And I want it to be laser sharp, so I'm going to expect it to be exactly right. I want the difference to be 0 every time. I'll show you one test that works and one test that fails. So basically, I can run the test, and I don't know how readable this is or even interesting, but it's super hard to read. Sorry. We're waiting for the server to come up. It's listening. It's running our tests. First one passed. Header component worked. Option selecting doesn't work. It's off by 35%. So going back to what we set up in the protractor conf, we have our actual directory. Here's what the header should look like. Here's what the options should look like, because I named them something that I could read, so I know what I was doing. Looks okay to me. What's up with the baseline? This is the ones I checked in to get, so I can find them later. Options looks the same. It's maybe a little bit bigger. What I like about this is it gives me a diff. It overlays the two pings, and it makes it pink where I'm off. So if someone maybe wasn't paying attention, they were looking forward to their 5 o'clock beer, they committed something that shifted the padding a little bit on this checkbox, on these radios rather, this is going to blow up in every component I showed you in that diagram. Maybe it doesn't matter. These all still fit on the same line. But in some instances, they may drift too far apart and they start to wrap. And that's going to trigger a bug. So this actually is a problem. And now I can see here, oh shit, something's wrong with the component. I can go back and I know exactly where to look. And I can tell it's probably padding, in fact. So the only other thing to mention is that when you're generating a new test, let's say that this is actually the correct version of the component because I changed the shared library because padding was too small, someone was complaining. The only thing I have to do to make this test pass the next time is move this ping into the baseline folder, and it becomes the new reference image. So the next time I run the test, it knows what to look at. It's the new ping. Everything is good. Is that lightning enough? Did I speak too fast? Yeah.
So when do you generate the baseline?
Good question. So the best way to generate the baseline is just to write the tests. And I've actually worked with a bunch of people here to do that. Write the test, let it fail, then evaluate the actual image. Does this look right? And in some cases, you can email it or send it through Slack to your UX person and say, is this legit? I know you changed these icons, but I didn't look at them. I just know that you changed them. Is this what you expected? And they can look at the ping and verify it for you. Anything else?
Be
Yeah.
configured for IE browsers and stuff.
Oh yeah, you bet. Any browser that Protractor supports, you can configure it for. We're Chrome shop for devs mostly, so that's what we're using here. The headless option is super fast. So.
So can you think of a way that when I'm developing, I end up going cross browser and testing manually? So
Yep. So actually, it saves the device settings, and also if I wanted to test like a different pixel resolution or a different screen size, if I wanted to test the responsive layout of the check radio button component, for example, it names them all for you, so you can have different reference images. Yeah, thanks. More?
Is it only one image format? PNG is the other format.
Just does pings. It's open source. It's okay. You want GIFs? Anything else? All right. Time for the final beer. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for coming. We will have another meetup next week. It isn't posted yet, but Sharon and I are just finishing up planning. Definitely let us know if you guys have a topic that you are interested in, something you're working on. We want to hear from you. Let us know. We can help to promote it to not only here, but if you guys are interested in conferences and that type of thing. Sharon and I love to help people apply and get into talking at conferences as well. So let us know about that. Let's give it up one more time to McGraw-Hill for the hosting and the food and everything else.
That's pretty interesting.
Yes, we're going. What's up? Yeah, definitely. We don't know why. Yeah, exactly. We just want to stay in because of oh, yeah. Well, tomorrow we're actually going to a progress conference. Of course, they're not a problem. So, I usually seriously right to set the goal. Yeah. And I was always thinking about it. And now, a lot of people I see you around me. You get a lot of it. Well, I like all the people on the Tower team. So I didn't know if we're talking oh, yeah, that was the legacy. So, yeah, I'm sure lots changed. Oh, I wouldn't imagine so. Actually, I know for sure that some part of the but I
I was loving the reaction. Wow.
I think that would be things too. It's always a mix.
Usually
so many other, most of the big things have so many companies that together, so like
So,
it's constantly upgrading stuff. So
I just get some years do it again. No, I'm making it.
it's hard to tell when we get to work.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And we can worry
Always so full. I took training. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I know this was about the last time.
my favorite side is but I'm selfish.
So you're ahead of a lot of us. Just
Years of experience.
Oh, great. Yeah. You wouldn't want to. How does that create service? Gotcha. We need to. That's right. Hey, great meeting you. Take care. Thank you too. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. That's why it's that's why it's that's awesome. You gotta show people. You should definitely give a talk. Okay. Yeah. And you should definitely show that off. So you say when it works consistently, I gotta figure out. You'll get there. I don't think we can use but to be fair, so I had to write it, but it works. So it doesn't. We don't have open source. Yeah. And if you want to see this, here's the thing. We want to check out. Yeah. It's good for you. I know that I yeah. You guys have any like oh not hard to find. Oh yeah, oh really? 12 people there. Yeah, 5 people. Right, I guess I'll say 5 seconds. That's all right. No. G for that mic. 20 minutes. Solid.
Are you on the Boston JS Slack? Don't think so. They have a section for recruiting. Try to get like us on.
DPG has that?
No, I think it's gonna be the unbelievers. Yeah, I was told we're not. It's
I'm trying to write. Unlimited vacation.
Right, like, I think that's like the
I
stats.
know 1% rate is all the.
Right? When you get
You barely get away for 3 days without it.
Exactly. Yeah. We're coming to play.
one day I take it off. How does this work?
There's 2 managers on the contract. Hey, we're going to talk to this guy. Contract, right? Like, great. I'm salmon fishing, man.
Yeah.
And then they come back, they upload a decline. You think this job posted immediately. And like 3 more days ago. What the hell is going on with this job? And I had to outline this office for reset. Oh, we did the right thing. And it's like, I emailed Brian live. I'm like, well played. It's like the same work we get behind his office. He's sticking around with his contract. He's sticking with his contract. They're going to put him somewhere else. But he's in big. Yeah, so I heard they go to applications because they don't want to these words. Really, we only take 3 to 4 projects. It's like anybody now really takes advantage of it.
That my team is still very small.
Well, I work with
I haven't seen DJ in months.
I work on
His carries are she has
I get really weirded out if I'm working 2 days remote and come back to different stuff.
Yeah.
Well, right, because so many
They're
meetings
gonna save
happen,
it.
and it seems like,
Yeah, it's weird when people adhere to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Different than throwing code, you know, so. It's hard to.
The thing is, like, especially here, like, on my island, because I don't have a key for me to go. But it's like, it's much work. I might go back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
no,
You're good. So, work. I'll be I did this conference from here.
Oh, okay.
It's stuff we got to see last time I was here, so.
Or you just visiting?
Yeah, I'm just out here for the. I'll be here for Sunday, so. I got.
Oh.
Yeah, so technically, usually I fly a day early, but it usually depends on the day late. It's like, then paying for Saturday. So, depending on by your desk, I need to. Top 5 bars. What's that?
My other mic said you were staying over my coffee.
Yeah, I see that. I'll order.
There's no coffee. There's some good bars on close.
This whole cruise was shit. Oh, wow. It's called quarters. Yeah, it's chill. I guess maybe
Oh, yeah.
Money he doesn't spend, he doesn't keep.
I mean, well, the West was like 500, $290. Like, wow, it's ridiculous. So, well, let's just write this down real quick. And I'm like, oh, so
Hotels, whiskey.
White Files, Browns, and whiskey.
I was recruiting
Developers. That's how you treat them.
Well, I was just in New York to meet like a couple managers, and they all think like we work from home surprisingly. And I told me this 2 months ago. I'm like, all right. No, it was like VP level. It was like, no, it was really show level. Like, I didn't.
People like that.
Yeah, I was the office.
It's centrally located.
Right. Oh, location where
space.
It's really. I
So I'm in Columbus and like the old blocks downstairs. So you walk up 2 and 3, it's all high jump, which this guy's right here. But it's worse there. It's not like Columbus takes it to a whole new level. Like theirs, it's like chips off the cube, stuff like that. I don't know, it's just not cool like inviting space unless you go like to the executive suite where it's all like glass.
Yeah,
You
it's all
expect,
full
right?
camera.
Yeah. So like it's not not good water. Ran away. So yeah, nobody really hands on their time. It's going to the locker.
Yeah.
So took my house and
Nice.
then I went to my first town acquisition. He was in town, so I got to meet up with him. We went to Spark, and he's like, "We're going for John Guy. We're going to this guy's house there."
Oh, that is sweet. That's fun.
This is kind of one of my favorite house ones too.
It's very chill.
Definitely very. It feels like my plants don't die all the time. Kind of easy all the time. Not much, you know. Okay.
Yeah, I just grew jalapenos in here over the winter. That's how good it worked. I was like, what?
Did it even happen? It happened.
Apparently it didn't get cold enough to like kill them. So it just kind of happened. And then like, I took the seeds and planted some more, and now he does them.
You gotta be chilly in the wintertime.
Yeah. Do it, man. 6 months.
Please tell me that ice was growing.
Water is.
Water.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like that crazy storm.
Yeah.
So the North flooded. Yeah, and like the
How deep is it?
enough to flip things, like upstairs, which is a lot.
Right.
That was just terrifying.
And that was actually right.
Yeah, that was on the other side.
We went to Brooklyn for lunch today, so now you gotta jump down.
Yep.
And I was like, these guys did some residential parking, like all three like the floor parking, the parking under the bridge, and that was telling me the other bike that I was like, I think Miroslav was telling me that water comes here in the wintertime. Or like
You can, yeah. Well, there's going to be a hurricane this week. May happen again.
wait, what this weekend?
Yeah. This week, like,
I feel like we should have expected it by now. Yeah, 100% chance we're gonna do it.
great.
No, I got my brother.
Oh, nice.
Oh,
Oh, awesome.
like, oh,
Right on Alabama, okay?
It's fun.
it's fun.
One time it's fun.
Yeah.
There I was seeing it, let's pack it up.
It's
Pretty much.
well,
Like the freedom for you kids, you gotta go to
Right. And I was just like, don't worry, I'm actually anything for.
Well played.
Right? We actually, I was home 2 weeks ago back in Southern California, which I'm here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Yeah, it's great quality. Like, you can do it there. To like, go to the black door, walk in. It's just like classic, it's not like porch. Walk in, dirty. There's just one fancy that I don't tell
How are you?
so you're
yeah, it's normally I say less around.
yeah, that's great.
Well, it's because they had the other like the other recruiter, his wife
Got it.
So, yeah, and it's like
That's true, yeah.
so, oh yeah, I look it up.
As long as it's easy to get here.
It's walking. It's about a quarter mile away, so that's what. Okay. I factored that in like. This is good. Try. Yeah. Rainproof. This is here's that fair crack. Oh wow. It's accurate. Yeah. They said Gucci was I was gonna be all they did. They really did. Yeah. Yeah. No, I saw it. I got a ribbon. Yeah. Yeah, he's got no worry. Yeah. That's awesome. Yes, I'm going. Consolidated this one. Oh, beautiful.
You know, usually the admin knows this for us.
You guys by far have the best confidence.
Actually, no, I have to go on every once in a while I'm getting really low to get my own parts.
Let's go to Costco and sell it at a higher price. Somebody just do a run.
Ship it,
Oh.
Cool.
Good night, everybody.